let's start with actually what is water governance. So the whole research project is about water governance, but what are we talking about here? So first of all, what is governance in the first place? So many of you will have heard about what governance means. Let's go back to what the term actually means, and it comes from the Greek term, and it means to govern, to steer, to guide. Similar fields you find in cybernetics, for example, but also the term government, of course, has the same linguistic background here. So governance is, in its original term, meaning like the steering of society. And I think this is something like really important to keep in mind, because the whole governance discourse really is about how can tools, how can procedures, arrangements be found that somehow guide and steer society into something better, into something more sustainable. And of course, in the water field, we know that there is a lot that we still need to guide society into. One more thing on this slide I'd like to draw your attention to, and this is by Renate Mainz here, this so-called problem-solving bias of governance. So the governance discourse kind of assumes really that those who engage with it really are interested in the betterment of society. I mean, we all know that that might not necessarily be the case. So what we're sort of blinding out here a little bit is the whole issue of politics, lots of the issues of symbolism, for example, that is also very much part of day-to-day politics, but that is not so much at the core of the governance discourse. So take home that governance in this way really means how can we craft institutions that are there for the betterment of society to reach collective goals. So having said that, governance is, and many of you will know that, a highly ambiguous concept. So in the social sciences, of course, we're constantly dealing with ambiguous concepts, and governance can mean three things. And I want to very, very briefly touch on these. So first of all, it can broadly mean just governing. It can also mean something more specific, as the governance discourse shifting from government to governance. That implies that governance more has a notion of governing without necessarily having government strongly in place. And thirdly, governance in a more specific, yet more specific sense can also mean governing the right way, so good governance. First of all, as I said, governance can simply mean governing. So as a descriptive, analytical umbrella term, governing activities and structures, it's on the how of policy making. And in that sense, it's a very general term, and I would mostly use governance in this term, actually. So it encompasses both structures and institutions, processes of decision making. It encompasses rule-setting entities, but also those systems of rules, formal, informal processes. It coordinates and it steers within all spheres of policymaking, like policy, the polity, the system, and politics, as I said, so the struggles, the conflicts around that, and it can embrace state as well as non-state regulation. So second, and that is, of course, important, because if you find the governance discourse, it very much prominent, you will find this discourse on moving from government towards governance. So many people who use the term governance kind of imply something as multiple levels, multiple actors, multiple modes of governance. So you find lots of literature on that. And the governance term probably became like so popular in the course of this kind of alleged shift from government to governance. That doesn't mean that empirically that is so, but on the discourse level, we certainly find that. And thirdly, as briefly mentioned already, governance as good governance, we find that, for example, in the discourse of the World Bank, and we've got lots of indicators of what good governance may mean: openness, participation, accountability, and so forth. So you'll find the term good governance often when people say we need more governance. So then they typically mean we need more good governance rather than governance in an analytical term. So watch out whenever you read the term, and kind of reflect for yourself which of these meanings actually is conveyed with the term. Getting a little bit more specific, so we're embedding water governance here within the overall framework of environmental governance. And a colleague and I have once tried to operationalize this for want of a good textbook that actually has a definition like that. And here we define environmental governance as the totality of interactions among societal actors aimed at coordinating, steering, talked about that, and regulating human access to, use of, impacts on the environment. Environmental governance arrangement may be directed towards a range of causes, including conservation, environmental protection, spatial land use planning, management of natural resources, protection of human health, and may operate across various scales to address local and global environmental problems. Now, specifically water governance, and here I'm drawing on a definition by Claudia Postel. Water governance is the social function that regulates development and management of water resources and provisions of water services at different levels of society, and guiding the resource towards a desirable state and away from an undesirable state. So again, here, many of the elements that we talked about already, you can find in here. A water governance system is the interconnected ensemble of political, social, economic, and administrative elements that perform the functions of water governance, and these elements embrace institutions as well as actors and their interactions. So a bit more specific on the element of water. So having defined this, looking back a little bit into contemporary history of the governance discourse and why that became so prominent, may be useful to remind ourselves of the works associated with the tragedy of the commons and the solutions that have been proposed for that. So on this slide here, you don't find the term governance, but I promise on the next slide you will. So the tragedy of the commons, very, very briefly, put forward by Garrett Hardin in his famous science article, end of the 1960s, kind of hold that whenever multiple actors are trying to collectively manage a scarce resource that is only renewable at a certain pace, there will be a tendency to overuse, assuming that there are rational actors. There's a lot of game theory around that. You find that in the prisoner's dilemma, for example. The thing is that sort of rational self-interest drives people to kind of overuse the resource at the cost of the collective thing. So, and there is lots of theories and some observations around that. The results is, or the solutions kind of is propagated by Hardin and by others, that in this kind of a solution, there should be a regulation, state regulation, who says, for example, that everyone may only put so and so many piece of cattle on the field, or privatization. So everyone has their own little plot of field. So these two solutions have been put forward. And we know, of course, there are lots of these commons tragedies around, like climate, global climate change is, of course, one of the most prominent ones, but we've got lots of them in many, many fields. Then, of course, Elinor Ostrom, in her famous book, 1990, prominently responded to this model by Garrett Hardin and said, well, it can't be that either privatization or like top-down state policy, that it can't be that those are the only solutions. So she put forward not the tragedy of the commons, but she said we're governing the commons. Governance should be the solution that is beyond just state or just the market. She received the Nobel Prize for this, and the core element here is that the involvement of all affected parties play an important role in the development of institutions, that is, of rule systems in the use of natural resources, and through this sort of self-governing common pool resources, instead of having either the state or sort of the cold market doing this. Now, there's lots of examples also in the water field for that. I won't go into details, but there is, Elinor Ostrom studied empirically like lots of self-governance resources. Typically, they were relatively local, they were relatively clear-cut and had clear boundaries. They had specifically crafted rules on how to deal with problems of natural resource governance, monitoring and enforcement systems, and so on. But what unites those is that none of them are really situated on a on a very high level of governance. So they're pretty much local. None of them like had the level of what is a modern nation state, for example, today. So that bears the problem of kind of upscaling. So this, what works on the local level in terms of self-governance, how does it work on the global level, for example, for climate change, for solving global water problems, and so on. So that is still an open question. Also, the later works of Lynn Ostrom haven't like really resolved that issue in a satisfying manner. What can we take from this? So from Ostrom's work, we see that participation is important because it's involving the local people of the community, but we also see that scale somehow seems to matter. So here we find the local scale as to be like very important for things to work, but we're uncertain about the global scale. So those are, I think, two excellent reasons why we should talk about participatory and multi-level scale adapted water governance, and that's what we're going to do right now. So we'll start out with participatory and collaborative water governance. First of all, why is participation important? And there is a bunch of rationales that you could identify. And here you find three sort of clusters of rationales why participation should be important. And those also map like very roughly a historical tendency. So in earlier times, and by this I mean like 1960s, for example, there was a very strong discourse on emancipation. So participation had to do with the questioning of authorities, of elites. It had to do with empowerment, with self-determination, which of course we also find in Ostrom's work, right? Self-governance, self-determination. Second discourse is that on legitimacy. So having more participation, having people participate in their own matters as to make decision-making more legitimate. And that has to do with transparency of public decision-making. It has, of course, to do with democratic values. Also such technical things like preemptive legal protection. And by that it is meant that in big planning processes, people who participate in the planning intensively then will not necessarily have so much rights for kind of take legal action after a project has been done. So all of these things have to do with legitimacy. And the third discourse is that what you might label on effectiveness. And nowadays, much of the discourse on participation, also what you find in policy documents, for example, is very much shaped around the notion of effectiveness. So the idea is that participation will yield better informed solutions because local people who know about the problems at hand will be involved. Its participation is supposed to create ownership, acceptance, and more identification with decisions being made, and through that also help implement solutions so that in the end, more sustainable solutions are being reached. So effectiveness as, I would say now, nowadays, the most dominant discourse here in the field. You might also call this discourse on effectiveness an instrumental claim. So the idea is, or the proposition is, that participation can be used as an instrument in governance. So, and that again links, of course, back to our notion of governance as steering, right? So participation also is seen as one important element in the toolbox of governance tools, namely one that also helps bring about more sustainable solutions. And here you just find a couple of relatively early quotes from the scholarly debate on why participation should be instrumental in getting improved environmental outcomes of public decision-making, governance outcomes, that is. Now, of course, there are counter arguments. So there's not just everyone who says, participation is a great thing. So many also point to difficulties. Some, for example, say that participation, especially if you look at open processes where everyone can come, that also reproduces existing power structures, because those who can come, who have the power to do so, will be more established ones than, let's say, ordinary lay citizens. Also, it has been emphasized that extreme positions prevail in participation. So those with particularly contra and pro arguments are more likely to participate than sort of what has been termed like the silent majority. The more people participate and the more, let's say, collective actors are involved in participation, the more difficult it may get. So theorists have called that veto players. So participation might be inhibited by very, very many people taking part in decision making. Also, it has been criticized that participation, so there might be a thin line between like what is still legitimate participation and illegitimate exercise of influence. So if you see participation could also be a form of lobbying, and what is the difference between lobbying and participation? So it might not be so easy in all cases. Others also said that this participation encourages decisions at the lowest common denominator, in particular, if consensual decision-making is aimed at, and a lot of participation does aim at a consensual decision-making. From the social psychology side, Cook and colleagues have pointed to certain mechanisms that are labeled risky shift, groupthink, manipulation, that also can distort participatory processes, but that could be counteracted or counterbalanced with a really good moderation or mediation. And finally, Brigitte Geisel had pointed to the idea or the fear that a lay participation might contribute to replacing expertise by mere opinion. Of course, also there might say that technocracy might not be the solution to everything. I don't want to go very deeply into this picture that where colleagues and I tried to assemble the arguments pro, but also contra participation from the viewpoint of how can participation actually lead to better environmental outputs and outcomes. So very briefly, just what you can see sort of on the left-hand side, what we call the independent variables here, so certain modes of participation, and they might lead either to better environmental outcomes or the acceptance of decisions, and finally also the implementation of decisions. So it kind of summarizes what we just heard, and all the little arrows there mark the causal mechanisms through which participation from the left-hand side might work towards better environmental outcomes on the right-hand side, where a plus sign means that there's a positive relationship and minus sign might mean that that's a negative relationship, and the numbers are actually just numbers. So just a conceptual condensation of causal mechanisms that are prevalent in the literature on how participation can actually work. So that could be used as a conceptual framework for studying participation. If you put yourself in the position of someone who, say, organizes participation or wants to organize or thinks about organizing participation, then there is this hands-on scheme developed by Vroom, Yetten, and Jago. Those are actually economists, and they were looking at the question, so when actually should I do participation? And here again, I don't want to go into detail, but the way you should read this is it's kind of a tree of questions, and you go through all these questions and either answering yes or no to these, and then you end up with any of this, what they call decision-making styles, from autocratic to group decision-making. And here you could we need a bit of translation from the business talk here. So leader would mean, let's say, the public agency, and the team would be the broad public or whoever is entitled to participate. So why am I showing this? Even though it looks complex, it's actually relatively simplistic. It's just yes, no questions, just 7 questions. It's just a very limited number of decision styles and so on. But why I think that this such thinking can be useful is because it points to the fact that we don't necessarily need to have like a full-fledged, like really intensive participatory process for every problem that there is. So there might be relatively simple decision-making processes where it's relatively clear, relatively routine-like, and then you don't need to involve like everyone. It's maybe in some processes you just need a good consultation process. And in other processes, and of course, in many of the real governance processes, tackling water governance problems, we'll probably be ending up in group decision-making because many stakeholders need to be involved. because decisions are uncertain, information is not prevalent, and support is also not necessarily given. But it reminds us that not every decision making process needs to be full-fledged participatory. So having looked at these functions of participation, I think we're now ready to define what we mean by participatory governance. And here again, in that paper that I talked about earlier, colleagues and I have defined participatory governance as those processes and structures of public decision-making that engage actors from the private sector, civil society, and all the public at large, with varying degrees of communication, collaboration, and delegation of decision power to participants. So participation here refers to the involvement of non-state actors normally. Collaborative governance is a concept that is very much alike, and especially in the North American context, we find the term much more often than in the European context. And oftentimes when North Americans talk about collaborative governance, they mean things that Europeans would term participatory governance. Nonetheless, there is a bit of a difference. And here, let me read aloud that definition by Emerson and Navachi, 2015, that collaborative governance includes those processes and structures of public policy, decision-making, and management that engage people across the boundaries of public agencies, levels of government, and or the public, private, for-profit, and civic spheres to carry out a public purpose. And then they also say that could not otherwise be accomplished. I personally would leave that out, because to engage or not in collaborative governance, often it's more a choice than a necessity. But what's important here is that collaboration stresses that element of working together as opposed to the involvement of non-state actors. So it's actually nuances that you find in these decisions. Okay, what is important if we want to engage also in empirically studying participation? I believe it's important to kind of have a bit of a better notion of analytically what do we actually mean when we talk about participation. And of course, we had these definitions here, and you find a couple of elements in these definitions. And what we find here is that participation often refers to the who participates, how is participation being done in terms of communication, and on what is actually the influence that participants have. And you find a range of literatures of any of these dimensions of participation. So for example, in the late 1960s, the famous ladder of participation was developed by Sherry Arnstein, who distinguished kind of non-participation on the lowest level to full citizen power on the highest level. And through this, you kind of had a ladder of participation on to what extent is power delegated to the participants. Degree of power sharing. Second, we look at who is actually participating. Is it, let's say, very local? Is it the whole country? Is it the broad public? Or is it just selected experts? So representation, who is actually taking part? And finally, how intensive is communication? So is it giving people information, or is it getting information from those people? And again, you can put that into this three-dimensional field here. Finally, I'd like to remind ourselves that participation typically doesn't happen in a void. So whenever we talk about participatory governance, and you see that little rectangle there, it's put into a larger set of political processes that also involve lobbying, private applicants, and so forth. So that is important that we are reminded also of that. Multi-level scale-adapted governance, our second topic. Let's start with the famous paper by Huche and Marx in 2003, who distinguish two types of governance. And let me directly jump to this next slide here, because the general take here on multi-level governance is again one of design choices. So multi-level governance systems, often they pre-exist, but the basic questions are here on how jurisdictions, on how decision-making competencies should be distributed between levels. So it's a design problem, designing governance. And what Hoch and Marx say, there are two basic types of multi-level governance. One is what they call type 1, and here the intellectual foundation is federalism. The important point here is that structures are nested, and multi-level governance type 1 is what we typically find when we've got municipalities which are nested into counties, and the counties are parts of, let's say, provinces, and they're a part of nation states, for example. So that's a system-wide, durable architecture. And as opposed to that, more fluid, more task-specific jurisdictions, which they call multi-level governance type 2. And this is what is particularly interesting in the water field, because it also points to river basins, for example. And river basins cut across established forms, type 1 forms of multi-level governance, but those are more fluid and are characterized by intersecting memberships and flexible design. So if you want to compare that, multi-level governance type 1 and type 2 have different pros and cons. Now, if we look at coordination in multi-level governance, and especially at this sort of scale-adapted governance, so where the river basin scale is seen as one level of governance, then it might be that too many actors and too much coordination within those new forms, new scales of governance might inhibit important coordination. The strategy of multi-level governance type 1 is that the number of autonomous actors is limited, whereas in type 2, it is that the coordination costs are limited by constraining interaction across jurisdiction through those task-specific jurisdictions. So it's easier to have upstream and downstream problems within one new jurisdiction. So just looking at river basins here, for example, the international river basins in Europe. So Robert Dahl has termed a democratic dilemma between citizen participation and system effectiveness, linking participation to multi-level governance. So he said that participation is mostly being done effectively at the very, very local level, whereas the further we upscale, the more difficult it actually is to get good participation going. Whereas lots of environmental problems in particular could be more effectively solved at a slightly bigger level or slightly larger level than at the very local level, just for these reasons of, let's say, integrating upstream, downstream problems. So that he terms this democratic dilemma. Another dilemma here is by Thomas Kuhns, for example, that oftentimes local decision-making involves different infrastructures than those on higher levels of governance. So quite a number of trade-offs we find on the whole between scales and participation. Okay, a bit of examples to illustrate participation and multi-level governance. And here I want to take the European Union Water Framework Directive. And first of all, look at a couple of quotes here that demonstrate how participation is being seen here. And the key point here is that participation really is seen as an instrumental value, as something that is used as a tool to achieve objectives of this big piece of European water legislation. That was in 2002. And that nicely, I think, aligns to what we earlier said about like the general take of governance. Now, the model through which the Water Framework Directive governs is what a colleague and I have termed mandated participatory planning. So the idea is that the European Union issues the directive, and the implementation of that directive is again devolved to the member states. It's not just that the member states should somehow implement the directive and somehow lead to good water status, but the member states also have to do specific plans and programs, and those have to be done in a participatory way to only then achieve ecological, environmental goals of the Water Framework Directive. So that's the specific mode of governance that we find here. And if we illustrate that by this graph here, you find a policy cycle of how the Water Framework Directive was devised, and you see in the implementation phase, another kind of a policy cycle where these plans and programs have to be devised. They are again implemented, they are reviewed, they are changed every 6 years, and you might as well find an element of adaptive governance in this, something we're not going to talk about today, but in another lecture. Adaptive water governance will, of course, play an important role. So if we now try to situate this model of the Water Framework Directive into this existing typology of type 1 versus type 2 multi-level governance, what do we find here? So mandated participatory planning, according to the Water Framework Directive, we first find that the purpose, of course, is task specific, right? We're talking about water governance, not general governance. The membership in the governance structures is typically non-intersecting because we have a river basin approach. The Water Framework Directive mandates river basins to be the main jurisdiction, the main scale of water governance. The number of levels is not strictly limited. The architecture is system-wide, it's non-competitive, and it's top-down initiated. So somehow we see that mandated participatory planning, the Water Framework Directive, sits between type 1 and type 2 multi-level water governance. So on this conceptual level, what does this model of the Water Framework Directive in Europe tell us? It kind of embraces participatory governance with multi-level governance, and all of that situated in, of course, policy implementation, because it's the member states that implement the directive. So the implementation process of the Water Framework Directive is like a very, very sparked a lot of attention. And so you can kind of see that at the intersections of these three conceptual debates, we find participatory implementation, multi-layer implementation, but also polycentric governance. So looking back at Ostrom here, and the whole model integrates into what we call mandated participatory planning. Okay, almost finally, I know we're talking about concepts and theories here, but this is sort of the one slide that shows some empirical or condenses an empirical analysis on the Water Framework Directive, where colleagues and I looked at to what extent did the directive actually change the water governance landscape in Europe. So you can see the European country abbreviations here. And we have on the horizontal axis participation, on the vertical axis river basin management. So to what extent did the Water Framework Directive actually change practices in the member states? And we can see that on the vertical axis, most countries improved or did more river basin management than they did before. And also almost every country improved in participation as compared to their water governance previously to the Water Framework Directive, with the exception of Denmark, that sort of changed back to a slightly more authoritarian water governance regime as compared to before the directive. Good, and with this little empirical outlook, just two final reflections of what we heard today. So certainly, participatory, collaborative governance, multi-level scale, adaptive governance, those are key elements of sustainable water governance, and they also form part of many important water governance paradigms. And that's, of course, something that will play a big role in the Newig project, and whether and to what extent actual participation and multi-level water governance on the ground will deliver. So like those patterns of water governance, whether they will actually deliver and that they help resolve prevalent problematics, that really is first and foremost an empirical question. Much depends on the context at stake. So what we heard today is lots of theory, lots of concepts, lots of terms that can be used to analyze these, but it will be part of the Newig project to actually look at in what ways do these actually deliver. Find lots of literature here at the end, and thanks for listening.